Our first presentation is going to be brought by Jevon Harding. She's a PG and a hydrologist with INTERA. I'm going to have her go into her whatever she thinks is relevant in her bio, and I'll ask her to come and we'll get started.
Hi, everyone. I hope I don't put everyone to sleep right after lunch, but I'll do my best. My name is Jevon Harding. I'm a hydrogeologist at INTERA up in the Austin office. I'm going to be talking about water level monitoring networks and the analysis of data for assessing DFCs. And INTERA does work with a lot of GCDs. In my personal experience, I've worked the most with Post Oak Savannah GCD, and obviously Gary, the GM, and Bobby were instrumental in helping me put this presentation together. So a lot of the examples that I use are going to be from Post Oak Savannah. Do I have a clicker? Do I have a clicker? Thank you. So the main things that I'm going to talk about GCD monitoring networks are in two categories. One is the actual design and implementation of your monitoring network and the issues that arise from that. And then the second section is how does that monitoring network actually work into the day-to-day management responsibilities of the GCD. So we're going to first talk about monitoring network design and especially coverage. How do you get good coverage with your monitoring network? And so in my perfect world, I'm a scientist, please give me all the data that you have. So I would like every well that is in, this is Post Oak Savannah GCD, I want to have all of that data. Whereas if you go and talk to Bobby, well, he probably doesn't want to monitor all of those, and every well owner is going to be like, well, why are you in my backyard every year? So one of the first steps, the strategies to improving your coverage, is to make those well owners aware of the benefits of monitoring. And so Post Oak Savannah has these advertisements that they run on social media. Here's Bobby's smiling face. Don't you want him monitoring your well? And brochures and handouts that explain what are the benefits of including your well in this monitoring system, and just trying to bring as many well owners on board that way. You also, if not out of the goodness of their hearts, you can also offer incentives. It's not the GCD's role to provide money for monitoring, to pay for monitoring wells, but you can have other indirect incentives. One would be Post Oak is implementing a groundwater well assistance program for people whose wells might be affected by dropping water levels across the GCD. And so to be eligible for that program, you would have to already be part of the monitoring program. So that's one incentive. Another would be to offer to help convert abandoned oil and gas wells. So that's sort of a win-win where a well owner gets a new well and the GCD gets a new monitoring well. So some issues to consider in bringing well owners into the monitoring system are monitoring agreements that allow for long-term access to the well, maintenance of the equipment, and making sure that when somebody sells that land, you don't just lose that well. So that needs to be written in. And then for stuff like the conversion of oil and gas wells, the GCD may need to accept some cost and liability associated with that, especially the P13 well forms for the Railroad Commission. The second strategy for improving the coverage of your monitoring network is, of course, working with your neighbors. So if you can imagine Gary Westbrook in his Mr. Rogers cardigan asking Alan Day, "Won't you be my neighbor?" And we've worked with the neighboring GCDs of Post Oak, Savannah. So that's going to be to the northeast as Brazos Valley GCD. And then to the southwest is Lost Pines Groundwater Conservation District. And so by incorporating those monitoring wells, we're able to, one, have more cooperation across our GMA, and also to provide more aquifer coverage, which is also always a great thing. So some issues to consider with that is just the fact that there are differences in sampling schedules between GCDs and in how they're taking their measurements. And then access to wells and, of course, the data. Do you have a streamlined way to share that data? Third strategy for improving your coverage would be to use wells from existing regulatory programs, for instance, the TCEQ or the Railroad Commission. For instance, in Post Oak, Savannah, there was a big Alcoa mine that had regulatory wells from the Railroad Commission, and when that mine closed, they were able to move those monitoring wells and incorporate them into the Post Oak Savannah monitoring network, which was a great addition. But some issues to consider with that is that transition period between when the stuff is closing, and to make sure that you get all the information you need so that it actually can effectively be used in your monitoring network. And last case scenario, if you don't have any other wells to add, is that you do have to break down and drill your own wells. And for that, you need land. So one of the ideas that Post Oak is pursuing is working with stakeholders for land or access to land to drill their own wells. For instance, counties and cities working with Milam and Burleson counties on some of their properties, on road easements, parks, buildings. And if your GCD has a good relationship with the TxDOT people, then maybe you can access road easements on those areas too. Like I mentioned, doing abandoned oil and gas well conversions, and this idea of putting in very small non-pumping monitoring wells is a great idea, because you can put those in very cheaply and quickly, and not have to deal with the pumping equipment. So some issues to consider when drilling your own wells, of course, are, well, you have to pay to drill your wells, and then also the maintenance and monitoring costs. As you're adding additional wells, you also have to account for what are the longer-term costs for that. And then this isn't on somebody's, private property, so one of the concerns might be if you're leaving equipment on those on, maybe just a road easement, to account for what's going to protect that equipment that you're leaving out there. All right, so you're designing your monitoring network. You think you have all the good coverage. So now we need to talk about defensibility. Basically, is your monitoring network defensible? And by that, I mean both scientifically, legally, and perhaps most importantly, in most cases, is in the court of public opinion. And some ways to establish the defensibility of your system, one of the main starts would be to have monitoring protocols, standardized monitoring protocols in process, and have official forms, record keeping that people can track back, standardized procedures by measurement type. Obviously, you want to have a protocol for if you're measuring via airline, E-line, transducers are going to be entirely different. So I'm just going to give an example of, this would be an official form that Post Oak Savannah has put together of when they go out and take a monitoring water level measurement, this is a form that they fill out. And so somebody could come back and say, okay, on this date, this was the measurement, and these are the different remarks that go with it. So just making that all standardized and transparent. Obviously, some issues to consider would be the consistency across GMAs and with TDUB, and considering, are we taking snapshot measurements versus continuous measurements? Like I said, if you're doing a one-time measurement, that's a completely different protocol than if you're putting in a transducer for continuous measurements. So then you have to say, what is your sampling time period? How often do you have to go check that? And another issue to consider, which I think is very important, is training. You can have these protocols in place, but then you have to be able to prove that, yes, my staff is trained to make these measurements. And so that's a potential role for something like TAG-D that could put together this training in all these water level protocols. And then you can tell your stakeholders, yeah, all of our staff has this certification. They went through this training and know how to take these water level measurements correctly. Another strategy for establishing defensibility is to have aquifer assignment methodology spelled out. And you can assign wells to aquifers via GAM surfaces, by well logs, by the TDUB assignments, or by aquifer response, sometimes in local situations. And you just need to have a transparent and accessible documentation of how you decided to assign a well to an aquifer. And this is an example of something we put together for Post Oak Savannah that I think is as clear and transparent methodology. So these are different wells in Post Oak Savannah, and you can see the black line where they poke down, and then where the screen falls, and then the colored blocks show where the GAM surfaces line up with that well. So you can show this and say, oh, that's why that well is assigned to the Sparta, because it falls in the Sparta. Some issues to consider, again, consistency across GMAs, and then consistency with TDUB. One of the issues that we have in Post Oak Savannah, for instance, is that TDUB assigns some wells by the major aquifer. In our case, that would be, so they say, oh, a well is in the Wilcox. And in Post Oak Savannah, we're actually subdividing the Wilcox into the upper, middle, and lower. So then their aquifer assignment might be slightly different than ours, and so making that clear. Another issue is how to deal with multi-screen wells, or wells that are screened over multiple aquifers. So going back to this example, we do have one well that is screened in both the Lower Yewa and the Sparta aquifer. So how do you decide which aquifer to assign that to? And right now, we have a percent rule. It's like if it's a certain percent in one aquifer, it gets assigned to that aquifer. But again, that methodology should be spelled out and transparent, so somebody's not coming and questioning your assignments. Another strategy for establishing defensibility is confirming the well information, making sure that you have the correct well location that can be mapped consistently. Just because when you go to take the water level measurement that, oh yeah, it's down the drive and behind the shed, that doesn't mean you can put it on a map consistently and let someone else know exactly where that is. Also need to know exactly what the depth in the screen is so that you can make that aquifer assignment reliably. And for that, we do have some technology for that. If you can play the video clip that I have, we do have some fancy toys at Post Oak Savannah. So this is a video log down well. So basically the camera goes down the hole and it's recording the depth on the bottom of the screen. And so you can see exactly where the screen starts and confirm that, yeah, that screen is where we think it is. And the other benefit of having a tool like this, it also, as well as going down hole, will also do a 360 view. And so this is basically spinning around and showing you what that well screen looks like and making sure that that's in good working order. So that's a really good tool to have to confirm that your screen information is what you think it is. And the help with that 360, again, is you can confirm that the well is working properly and is not contaminated. That might be an issue if you're doing water quality measurements, for instance. So some issues to consider, again, just not being quite sure about this information. If you have unreliable or unavailable well logs, you might need to rely on these video logs instead, which have a cost of both time and money associated with them. And then if you're trying to increase transparency by putting your mapping online, then that has its own additional costs as well. So I did tell Alan that I stole a screenshot from his website because ours is still in transition and I wanted a pretty picture. So this is basically online mapping of the registered wells. And the great thing about putting it online is that stakeholders can come in and say, oh, you have the wrong location on my well, or, oh yeah, that's right, I thought they had it wrong, but it's good. Or checking the different information on it and so it's sort of crowdsourcing confirmation of your well information. And that adds a lot of transparency, and then you can also easily distribute information. So you've designed and implemented the network. You think you have the best coverage you can get. You think you've made it as defensible as you can get it. So how does that monitoring network actually factor into your day-to-day management of a GCD? And how is your monitoring network used? And the idea behind this is, you have a monitoring network, so what? Is your monitoring network helping you decide what management strategies are going to be the most helpful in your area? And are your management strategies informing where you're putting your monitoring network? So those need to be interconnected as much as possible. And so one of the roles that could be important for a monitoring network is in the development process of a DFC, and basically showing, does your monitoring network help show if your DFC compliance is feasible or defensible? Are the DFCs that you're making realistic based on what you see in your monitoring network? Are these ranges reasonable? Are the aquifer subdivisions reasonable? Maybe your monitoring network is showing some issues with the GAM, and so you can, suggest GAM improvements based on your monitoring network. Again, issues to consider that, as with all DFCs, all GCDs in a GMA are different and have different DFCs, so the consistency across the GMA is important. Another role for the monitoring network would be to identify additional district issues that might not be covered in the general DFCs. For instance, in hydrologically sensitive areas. For instance, the Post Oak Savannah has these new, I think Gary was wanting to trademark this acronym, PDLs, or protective drawdown limits for our shallow management zones. And then if you are putting in additional, non-DFC limits, then you would need additional monitoring and additional costs to cover that monitoring to address those concerns. And then another role for the monitoring network is to, once you have the DFC in place, to help determine the DFC compliance. And so in order to do that, you probably should specify how the monitoring network is being used to monitor your DFC compliance, and establish monitoring thresholds in your management plans. So this is just a screenshot of the post-oak management plan. Please don't read all of this. I don't want y'all to fall asleep just yet. But I did highlight this section that shows that they have specifically said, yes, we are going to check the water levels and show if that is monitoring DFC compliance. And that is specified in their management plan as part of that. So, and again, issues to consider, it always comes back to consistency across the GMA. If you are trying to show DFC compliance, do you have enough monitoring coverage to sufficiently monitor that DFC compliance? And what are the costs associated with that, and how enforceable is that? And so that brings up the final point, which is, you have the role of the monitoring network specified, but how are you actually using that monitoring data in a way that's the most effective for your management goals? And so that's where, the science comes in. We want to use monitoring data in the most, scientifically defensible way possible. And that does mean accounting for data availability. We may not have data in the spots that we want the most, and that might be what you most need to know for your management strategies. So in post-oak savanna, we did go through a process where we were considering several different methods of analyzing the monitoring data, considering the pluses and minuses in each scenario, accounting for what data we actually had, and then testing for sensitivity and bias when we calculated drawdowns based on those methods. And so I'm going to walk through a couple of those options that we went through with post-oak. So we considered different spatial analyses, and the idea behind this is, so this is a map of, several maps of post-oak savanna, and the question is, do you want to use your monitoring data as just point data, as indicator wells? Do you have specific zones where you want to consider those wells together, or clusters or zones, or do you want to incorporate all of the data that you have and look at it as the total area? So that would be like all of the orange, basically all together. Another consideration is, what time period are you trying to make these measurements over? Do you want to look at seasonal data? Do you want to look at yearly data? So this is just an example of some of the options we looked at. And if you look at yearly data, sometimes, based on data availability, we only took one measurement that year, or that measurement was during drought. So all of a sudden you have a huge blip on your data map. And so the other option that we looked at was looking at moving averages, and I just sort of have an illustration of what that would be, is basically taking a 3-year window and looking at what the average water level was there. And that's kind of looking at more what's happening long term, and that sort of smooths over some of those blips in the data that you might get. We also considered different well selection. In post-oak, the DFCs are based on drawdown from 2000. So if we were measuring from the year 2000 to 2012, that was one of our windows, we had a lot more monitoring data in 2012 than we did in 2000. So if you're looking at the water level in 2000, that would be on the left-hand side, and then look at it in 2012 and try to measure the drawdown between those, all of a sudden you have some bullseyes in 2012, but those aren't real. That was just because we didn't have the data in 2000. Those wells were still there in 2000. We just couldn't incorporate that. So we're basically trying to find a way to make it apples to apples comparison, and only taking data from that we have it in both endpoint years. But then that has its own negatives, because then you're saying, oh, well, I'm not using all of the data that I possibly have. So I don't want you to read this. This just shows all of the different strategies that we went through with the post-oak board to try to come up with a best case scenario, or best case methodology for the data that we had available at the time in post-oak. And we looked at how many points we had, what we had in different aquifers, what time periods, whether we're using indicator wells versus interpolation. And we ended up, after discussion with the board, coming up with our methodology, which we thought was the best case for now. And so once you have a methodology that everyone approves of, you have to define that clearly by the district so that you can use it transparently, and that it's possible for someone to come back and say, oh, how did you get that drawdown measurement? And you can say, oh, this is how we did it. And they can come up, hopefully, with the same answer. So, and this is a diagram that we've put together and that hopefully will be included in future GCD documentation that illustrates and then also has step-by-step instructions for, how do we get that number. And some issues to consider with that are, stakeholder involvement and the acknowledgement that the easiest methodology might not always be the best in your particular aquifer or GCD. Indicator wells might be great in some areas where, things happen very predictably, and may be extremely biased if you pick them in other areas where stuff isn't as predictable. And of course, the third goal with using monitoring data in your management strategies is that you would be able to evaluate how your district is doing compared to its management goals. And so again, for that, to define it clearly in your management plan and rules and create thresholds for action. So you can have this monitoring data, but, okay, so it said this, now what do we do? And so just having that defined by the GCD beforehand. And so this is an example of a graph that we put together for post-oak based on the calculations that we did. So those top three blue points are the calculated drawdown values from 2000 to 2012, 2000 to 2014, 2000 to 2016. And the bottom line is the 2060 DFC. Slanted line would be what you'd expect behavior to be if the DFC is to be achieved in 2060. And the board has chosen to put in a threshold level of 50% of the DFC, so you can see when your monitoring data says it is hit that threshold. So that gives you an intermediate step before, instead of waiting to 2060 if something goes wrong, then by that time it's a little late. You can set in these levels where it'll, ping some further action level. Again, issues to consider with that, yes, what do you do after you meet a threshold, or what do you do if your monitoring network is telling you something? And then the final goal, obviously, for the monitoring network is to be used in the enforcement and implementation of your district's management goals. And this can include implementing, testing, and justifying, for instance, your well spacing rules, your production rates. Why do you have management zones where you do, and using your monitoring network to explain that. It can be used to work with permitting, to say whether someone needs well assistance. It can be used in legal decisions. Ideally, if you have a mitigation program going on in your GCD, a monitoring network could be used to judge the effectiveness of if that's working. And again, some issues to consider would be consistency within GMAs and the option for third-party review of your methodology and your decisions. So that was a lot of information. I basically tried to cram a session's worth of information into one talk. So I understand if there are questions. If we can't get to them immediately, I am available, Steve is available, Gary and Bobby obviously are available for the rest of today to answer any specific questions as well. So.
Any quick questions? If not, thank you for bringing this very interesting presentation.